So over to you, Samantha.
Thank you, Simon. Hello, my name is Samantha Taylor, and I'm a researcher here at IFI Global. Welcome to this month's Vision, which is intended to be a preview on the work we're doing on geopolitical and macro risk. You will be seeing more on both of these items in our future publications. I'm now going to hand you over to Simon Osborne, who'll be giving a brief introduction on these themes before we get into the interviews with Alan Sked, Michael Howell and Peter Crickwell. So now over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Samantha. And I guess it's good morning from Florida for me. And unusually, I am not where I normally am when we do these events. But I'm delighted to see that we have a good number of people from different countries around the world, including here in the US, where it is a public holiday today. It's Memorial Day. So thank you, those of you who are giving up part of your public holiday to join us this morning. We are going to, this always happens, I just said this to Samantha, always takes a second to kick into the first slide, but it gets there in the end. And we're going to give it one more go. Oh, there it is, finally. As Samantha said, we are going to be interviewing Dr. Alan Sked from London School of Economics on geopolitical the geopolitical environment. And then we are going to come to Michael Howell, not just on the US dollar future, but on macro issues in general. And then we are then coming to Peter Crickwell on risk governance matters, given the world that we now live in. And I would note in passing, you'll see doctors in front of each of those people's names. We have 3 speakers, but we actually have 4 PhDs amongst the 3 speakers today. Now, risk governance. It's a strong view that we have at IFI Global, and we're going to be getting into this particularly with Peter Crickwell later on in the discussion. The risk governance should be more forward-looking, it should be more holistic, and it should be more geopolitical. It should also be more macro, and I will be asking, challenging, questioning, particularly Peter on that. My view is that, to quote from Olaf Scholz, the relatively new German Chancellor, that we have, this is something that he said, we have reached a Zeitenwende. I'm sure Alan, who speaks German, will tell me my pronunciation of that is terrible. Zeitenwende, as I understand it, means a turning point in history from one epoch to another. He believes that the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians is that. I am putting forward the proposition, if that is correct, if Scholz is correct on that, then it could well be a Zeitenwende for the fund industry as well, because it has grown up, at least the international fund industry has grown up during a period of extremely benign geopolitical environment. Really, very little has gone wrong in the last 30, 40, 50 years. It's all gone the West's way, by and large. Well, I wonder whether that geopolitical environment, very benign, may be over. And I've been posing the question to a few people, if the fund industry perhaps had got going, say, in 1910, 1912, which was a very international investing environment. At the time, Argentina was the big emerging market. There was a lot of international investing happening. If there'd been a fund industry that had followed on from that, risk would have been dealt with in a very different way, given what happened in history in 1914, going through, of course, to 1945 and beyond. We've been very, very lucky, and will our luck maintain? And perhaps something we're getting into in the next few minutes. And again, my proposition that I'd like to put forward, particularly to Peter, but is whether or not non-quantifiable matters can be included in risk calculations. So IFI Global, as Samantha says, we are going to be bringing these matters much more into our various publications, particularly into the NED, which covers risk anyway as part of its remit. So we'll be covering, and the recent NED that's just gone out has more on this anyway, but it's going to keep on increasing it, and indeed it will be in some of our other publications as well. We now have 4 publications, so we'll be covering a lot of this in all of those, but especially in the NED. Examples of what we're going to be looking at right now, and doubtless go on into other areas, is what is the impact of the situation in Ukraine on the euro and upon the European Union. I'm going to be talking to Alan about that in a second, and whether it's because of Ukraine or not, or what all the weird and wonderful things happening in the world, what's happening to the US dollar. We'll be getting into that with Mike Howell as well, and perhaps touching upon something else, which is the new phenomenon people have been talking about, quote unquote, deglobalization. Are we in an era of deglobalization where we're not as dependent as we were upon just-in-time delivery system from all over the world? And what does that mean for markets? So that's enough as an introduction from me. I'm now going to stop sharing screen, and I'm going to make Samantha host, if I can do this properly. And hopefully we will come to Alan if he's there. So Samantha, you should be host now.
Yeah.
And over to you. Do we see Alan there?
He should be coming up in a second.
Yeah, great. Oh, great, there he is, fantastic. Alan, hello. I guess it's good afternoon. Hello. Thanks very much for joining IFI Global Vision today.
Thanks for your invitation.
I should have said in my introduction that we're going to use this event as a recording that we will be putting out to everyone to promote what we're doing in terms of risk governance and all of that. So we'll all have to be on our best behavior today, this particular discussion. Alan, let me ask you first that one of the reasons probably that we're in this weird and wonderful situation in Ukraine is because of this of the Germans over their policy towards Russia over the last however many years, decades, or certainly 1 or more decades. You met Angela Merkel at least once, I think. How do you, first of all, do you agree with the fact that one of the reasons why Putin decided to send his tanks into Ukraine is because of the position that Germany has taken? But if that is correct, how is it that Merkel allowed Germany to get into the situation?
Well, I suppose, like the whole German establishment, they believed that the main purpose of the German state was to export. And Russia was a huge export market, and you know, Germany is a pacifist state since 1945. It didn't want, the people didn't want to rearm. There was a huge movement called Ohne mich when German rearmament got underway in the 50s, and Germany has remained a pacifist state. And if you look at opinion polls in Germany over the last so many decades, they always show that the Germans aren't prepared to fight for the Baltic states, Ukraine, Poland, or anywhere else. So, and the Germans also believed, and this was a fundamental belief among especially the Social Democrats, who believed that they had broken the Cold War by having a policy of Ostpolitik with the Soviet Union, that started under Brandt. And they believed in a kind of special relationship with the Soviet Union thereafter. And they were going to live in peace, and by being kind to the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union would eventually become a normal state. Well, the Soviet Union did fall apart. But again, that only lasted a short time. And then Putin picked it up again and turned it into almost a new model of the Soviet Union. So, but this all passed the Germans by. They still thought they could still be on chummy terms, exporting all their goods to the Soviet Union. And they were still pacifists, and they had a very guilty conscience towards Russia because of the invasion that Hitler had done during the Second World War. And Steinmeier, the present German president, has said that, you know, they had to be nice to the Soviet Union because of the debt they owed them for invading the Soviet Union during the World War II. Anyways, the former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, is still on the board of Gazprom, the Russian gas giant, and he will not resign, and he will not condemn the invasion of Ukraine. And he's a major figure in SPD. And Scholz, the present Chancellor, like Steinmeier and Schröder, is one of these people at the very top of the German elite that still has this vision of somehow keeping the Soviet Union kind and nice and chummy and exporting to it, and being very upset by the fact that Putin actually invaded Ukraine, which they weren't expecting. They thought they could stop it, but in any case, they don't want to see Russia humiliated. And Scholz now has reneged on his promise to send heavy tanks and heavy armored vehicles and various things to Ukraine. He personally has refused to sign off the decrees which the German Defense Ministry have already approved. And, you know, it is quite clear that he himself is now an obstacle to getting the heavy weapons to Ukraine that they need in order to stop the latest Russian offensive. And you've now got the extraordinary situation where most of the European Union, apart from Poland and the Baltic states, are dragging their feet, not only on sending weapons, this includes France, sending weapons to the Ukraine, but also in implementing the oil embargo, which they've been talking about now for weeks and weeks and weeks, and which will not be implemented because the Hungarians have more or less vetoed it, and other countries like France and Italy in particular, which is very dependent on Russian energy, are not in favor of it either. So I don't think the oil embargo is going to go ahead. And the result is that, say, April this year, the European Union paid Putin no less than £33 billion in 1 month for energy deliveries. And in fact, the EU is now more or less funding Putin's war. As part of it, it's not helping Ukraine very much. It's not delivering weapons. It's actually funding Putin because it won't stop buying his oil and gas. So we have a remarkable situation where the German Chancellor is refusing to send weapons to Ukraine. The EU will not have an oil embargo, and it's more or less funding the Russians. And under these circumstances, Ukraine is fighting heroically against the Russian onslaught without getting the heavy weapons that it wants, either from Germany and the European Union, or indeed from the United States, which seems now to be lagging in its delivery of promised heavy weapons to Ukraine. So under these circumstances, a number of people, particularly in the European Union, but also in America, where you have people like Trump and Henry Kissinger, clearly now want an imposed settlement on Ukraine, which will leave large parts of Ukraine, particularly the Donbass, in the hands of Putin. Now, these people are under an illusion that all that Putin wants is a small part of eastern Ukraine, and he would be satisfied with that. He wouldn't. He is a Russian imperialist whose ambition is not just to take over eastern Ukraine, but to take over the whole of Ukraine. And perhaps if he's allowed to do that, if Ukraine is deserted by Europe and America and goes under, then of course Putin will start putting his sights on maybe the Baltic states, maybe Poland, who knows. Putin is not some minor Russian figure with a minor Russian agenda. He has a very big agenda. And the Europeans and the Americans are failing to see this, and that includes such idiots as Henry Kissinger, who's now appearing as a one-old war criminal, now supporting a new one.
Can I ask you, I'd like to bring the discussion, if I may, on to what all this means for the European Union and its future development. You made the point about Germany, you touched upon Hungary and France. What does this mean for the European Union? We've normally, when we've analysed the EU, it's all been about the potential problems of the euro and all sorts of issues surrounding that. This is obviously a geopolitical problem, and you've got the countries with the Baltic states you just touched upon, Poland, have been very strong in their support for Ukraine. But you made the point very well about Germany and to a certain extent Italy and France and Hungary and whatever else. What does this mean for the EU?
Well, it means in future, I think the EU is irrevocably split. Poland and the Baltic states, the northern part of the EU, is not going to be drawn into a system whereby they are more fully integrated economically into a centralized European Union, such as President Macron in France would like. And of course, the split between them will be economic as well as political, geopolitical. The states like France and Hungary and Italy are desperate to get back to the situation where the war is stopped, and therefore they hope the inflation that is now consuming the West will be stopped, because that's putting a great pressure on them. The present inflation in the Eurozone has gone up to 8.7%. I mean, it varies a bit, but 8.7% is the global inflation figure for the EU at present. And this is putting a burden on, say, the Italian economy, which has a national debt now of 155% of GDP. France has a national debt of 115% of GDP. Now, interest rates, you would have thought, given 8.7% inflation, and the size of the national debts, particularly in Italy, the interest rates would go up. But Christine Lagarde has only promised to put them up from 0% from negative rates to 0%, which is way beyond what's happening in Britain and America, below what's happening in Britain and America. And whether the bond market will accept rampant inflation of over 8.7%. In the future, at a time when these national debts are going up. I mean, I don't know, the Italian national debt, again, I think will be a key factor in the future of Europe, but the future of the euro.
I was going to ask you about that. Let me jump in there, because that was going to be my next question, is that Italian bond yields have tripled to 3% this year, and the risk spreads have ballooned to 200 basis points, and there's not going to be much more QE. As you say, that is putting Italy, even though its budget deficit came down a little bit last year, it's putting Italy under a lot of strain. French banks have a lot of exposure to Italian debt, as well as Italian banks, obviously. So we have, coming back to the broader question of the EU with the Italian problem, economic problems that you've just outlined, and the situation in the Ukraine and all of that, where does this leave the development of the European overall? If you're going to make some big, bold statements, where do you think this leaves the EU over the next, say, 3 years or longer?
Well, it's very difficult to forecast, because, I mean, if the Italian debt's going up and the quantitative easing is coming to an end, although it's coming to an end much more slowly in Europe than elsewhere, then who's going to buy the Italian bonds? That becomes a great question. And who's going to fund it? I mean, Macron would like to see, again, he keeps pushing, and Southern European countries keep pushing for some kind of degree of fiscal union. But with the German economy reeling, I mean, with huge inflation in Germany, unprecedented in modern times, and the future of the German economy unclear, given what's going to happen in Russia. Will it be able to export to Russia? on the huge scale that it did previously. If German exports and German inflation, German exports going to come down, German inflation go up, then there's going to be a backlash in Germany. And I should think under these circumstances, given that the German economy will become shaky, that the last thing the German public will want to do is to finance the debts of France, Italy, and Southern Europe. So I can't see any consensus arising on future fiscal unity. I mean, I think that will be impossible under these circumstances. So in all of these cases, I mean, I think there is a possibility, probability of some kind of Euro crisis in the next year or two.
Right, okay. Before we, the last area I want to touch on, because when we go into June, which we're about to, we have the French elections for the National Assembly. I'm sure you've been following that closely. What difference, if anything, where do you expect that to end, and what difference, if anything, will that make upon what we've just been talking about?
I don't think it'll make much difference. I expect Macron will get a majority. I mean, there are polls that show how unpopular he is. He only got about 28% of first preference votes in the presidential election. His party has got a very weak basis in terms of organizations throughout France. But then you look at what the opposition is, and again, it's extreme left-wing sort of Corbynista type people on the left with Mélenchon, and then on the right you've got Marine Le Pen and the Ralliement National. So I think he will probably get a reduced majority, but still a majority. And if necessary, depending on whether the Republicans survive, which is another question. I mean, if the Republicans do survive, he may have to go into coalition with them. But I mean, I suspect that he'll be okay. And in any case, when it comes to foreign policy, I don't know, Le Pen and Mélenchon are both very Eurosceptic, but they're both probably quite close to a Russian-friendly foreign policy, in which case I think it just adds to the tensions in the EU between those who want to see Ukraine survive and push the Russians back to their borders, and those who want to save face and give Putin some part of Ukraine so that they believe they can get a settlement which will allow things to go back to somehow or other to the status quo ante. All of this, of course, doesn't say how or who is going to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. I mean, Putin has just demolished, obliterated whole towns, and they'll have to be rebuilt. Even if he gets part of Ukraine, he's going to get, you know, this desert industrial landscape, which, you know, with all these towns, which will have to be rebuilt, and whether he's got the money and the resources to do it, I don't know. But somebody will have to do, and that's another question mark over whether the European Union and America will have a kind of Marshall Plan to rebuild Ukraine. But it'll involve billions, if not trillions of dollars in order to do that. So again, the European Union will probably have to cut its share of the reconstruction program, which again will be a huge burden on its central economy.
Well, yeah, that's a very good point, which I hadn't really just thought about, the reconstruction of Ukraine under whoever is, you know, in control of whichever part it may be, and both parts actually are going to need some reconstruction.
Oh yeah.
Last question for the day before we move on to Mike Howell. If someone was to put a gun to your head, Alan, and say, give us your best forecast. You've been studying, as I know, for many of you who won't know this, but Dr. Sked, for his sins, taught me many decades ago, and he's been following European politics and European history for a very long time. Speaks far too many languages for his own good. If you were having to make a forecast about, given all that you've been touching upon in the last few minutes, about where this leaves the EU, let's say in 3 years' time, let's say the end of May 2025. Give us your best forecast of where this would be, where the EU would be.
Well, I suspect it will be in crisis. I mean, because the splits are very deep, especially those between the northern parts and the southern parts. The economic problems are bound to get worse before they get better. And I don't think there'll be any consensus as to how you cure them. And one doesn't know what the international situation will be. But if the world goes into a huge hyperinflation or something, then it's bound to redound on the euro. And, you know, I don't think there'll be consensus on what to do about that. So, I mean, I suspect, I would say crisis.
Well, on that cheery, happy note, thank you. Thank you very, very much indeed. I will let you get on with your afternoon. Again, thank you very much for joining IFI Global Vision. Samantha, if we can put Alan back into the audience and bring Mike Howell up, that would be great.
Yeah. He should be coming up.
Is that working?
Mike, we can hear you, we can't see you, but hearing is better than, oh, there you are. We can also see you as well as hear you.
Right, okay,
welcome very much to IFI Global Vision. Moving on from the more sort of geopolitical stuff we've just been talking about with Alan to more the global macro stuff and the dollar. I would like to start out with a quote which I came across the other day from yet another LSEer. By the way, we have a surf of LSEers today. We have one interloper, Peter Cripwell, who wasn't at the LSE. Samantha was, Mike was, Alan was, and I am. So sorry to the rest of you for giving you too many LSE people in one go. But Adam Towes, who I think teaches as a professor at Columbia now, came out the other day and said that he said that we're in a situation now where we are facing extreme potential risks, and we don't know what it's going to be that's going to hit. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that we could be in a situation we are in extreme danger? Just before you answer that, I see global debt has reached 348% of GDP. It was only 269% at the peak of the last debt bubble in 2007. So what's your view on the overall global macro situation today, Mike?
Well, I suppose one has to agree with Adam Towes, but then that's always true, isn't it? There are always risks and uncertainties that you never quite capture. So I suppose by default, he's going to be right. I think to start with a hook to what Alan was just saying, I think in many ways, he's probably optimistic here, because Europe is actually dire. And I don't think we really or fully understand that. And the reason I say that is that what you're looking at is a sea change in European foreign policy, but more specifically economic and energy policy, that really started way back in the 1960s. In the 1960s, Europe took a decision to get most of its energy from Russia. And that was a decision that was basically triggered by a distrust of America, and particularly what America was doing in the Middle East. And so Europe took that decision. It built pipelines. It basically hooked itself up to Russia. We now know the consequences of that. Europe will have to pay for its energy, and that will come at a huge cost. So I think that, let's not delude ourselves that this is, going to end well, because I think Europe is in a really bad situation. What's more, if you start to extrapolate the effects of the Ukraine invasion on food supplies, Ukraine supplies North Africa, and in fact, a lot of Africa and the Middle East with food products. If those food products don't get through, which is every certainty they won't, there's going to be a refugee crisis. Europe has troubled in stopping that before. This is going to be like nothing else. So I think that the situation as it deteriorates is really focusing on Europe. Now, let me leave aside the good news for Europe here and start to look at what the dollar means. And I think that what I would say is to go to a speech that Janet Yellen made on, I believe it was April 13th, to the Atlantic Council, which have a rather awkward term of friendshoring. That is a very, very significant speech that I think everyone's got to think about and read, because what that's saying is the world is now bipolar. Essentially what it is, it's split between a friend world. If you're a friend of America, you're okay, you can get dollars, you can get access to the world credit system, etc. If you're a foe of the US, in other words, an enemy of the US, you're on your own. And people have got to decide that, and they've got to decide pretty quickly. And what the US is doing, in my estimation, is it's shaking the tree pretty hard. This is not an engagement against Russia per se. Russia was a sideshow. This is an engagement against China. And the world has changed, and it's changing rapidly. And it's dividing, or it's cleaving into two parts, a dollar world and a non-dollar world. And I recently wrote an article for the RUSI website, the Royal United Services Institute, about the dollar, and basically made the point that although people keep coming up with conjuring up these new notions that we're in a Bretton Woods 2 or a Bretton Woods 3 or a Bretton Woods 4 or whatever the number is, reality, Bretton Woods still exists. The original plan of Bretton Woods put the dollar at the center of the world financial system. It had institutions called the IMF and the World Bank to police things. And basically it was a system for allocating and circulating trading capital among friendly nations. And it purposely excluded China and the Soviet Union. We're back in that world. Bretton Woods never really went away. The dollar is paramount. We're in a situation where it'd be very difficult for any economy to get off that dollar hook. And, one wishes China good luck, because China is struggling right now in a situation where it's hit by COVID-19 lockdowns and where the dollar is going up. And it's very unusual to see a weak Chinese economy and a strong dollar. They have a seriously big problem.
Yeah, and the real estate, going to touch upon China. I see the real estate defaults, which were pretty bad last year, have continued on this year, and that makes up a large portion of the Chinese economy. As you touched upon, the extraordinary policy they have towards COVID, on top of which, Western firms don't want to invest there at the moment, worrying about whether or not China could get hit by the same kind of sanctions or something similar to what's happened to Russia. So they're not in a good spot at the moment. But coming back to your bipolar world, those countries that are not in the quote unquote US dollar bloc, such as China and its friends, what's the prognosis for them?
I think that countries have got to decide which camp they're in. Are they in the China camp, or are they in the let's say the US dollar Western orbit? And that's a decision that each has got to make. And I think that maybe this move by the US was precipitated by some maybe reluctance or foot dragging by many Asian countries when the US were trying to get a coalition against Russia organized in February, March of this year, where the idea of let's say supporting liberal governments was put to one side in favor of economics. And I think the Americans have come back and said, look, first things first, economics are one thing, but you've got to start thinking about the free world, and are you with us or are you against us? And the idea of economics is really Asia hooking up with China. They see their economic fortunes very closely with China, but their political fortunes are definitely with the US. And I think that's the sort of calibration to make here. Now, what does it mean for currencies and what does it mean for the world? I think that the dollar by design is going up. I think the US is shaking the tree. They want the Fed's balance sheet down in size to control inflation, but they want the dollar going up to create a credit squeeze worldwide. That may seem like suicide from an American point of view, but everybody else is in a much, much worse situation when they start needing dollars. They'll have to come cap in hand to the US Fed. Now, Adam Tooze, who you cited earlier on, made a very, very good point a couple of years ago in his book about the GFC, the global financial crisis, where he singled out the role of swap lines then that the Federal Reserve had basically reintroduced. They were critically important. And the Federal Reserve has realized the importance of these dollar swap lines for countries that need access to dollars for funding. And whenever there is a squeeze in financial markets and the dollar is needed, the Federal Reserve will be the marginal supplier. The Federal Reserve has leapfrogged the euro dollar markets as the marginal supplier of funds now. The Fed is critically important. If you want to calibrate that, the Fed's role is about 3 times what it was in the GFC. in terms of its potential right now. The dollar will go up. The Chinese yuan will struggle in the face of that. The Chinese currently, despite the or in spite of the COVID-19 lockdowns, are tightening monetary policy as we speak. April and May are normally big months for the Chinese People's Bank to inject liquidity into the system. What have they done? They've actually extracted 800 billion yuan over the last 10 weeks. That's about $120 billion out of their monetary system when they can least afford it. But at least they've managed for the moment to hold the yuan reasonably stable. If it starts to devalue, they've got a real problem. I suspect it probably will have to devalue, and that will then cause a second shoe to drop, which will be concerns about unfair trading for China, and there'll be a whole lot more sanctions put on, trade sanctions put on Chinese companies and Chinese trade.
Can you explain to me, because I'm never really properly, truly understood why the Chinese, amongst others, of course, there's lots of friendly regimes, like particularly the Japanese in the Asia Pacific region, who are huge buyers of dollars. But why have the Chinese been so happy to prop up the dollar as the world's global reserve currency? And given what you've said about this bipolar world that we're going into, will they stop buying dollars in the way that they have been over the last few decades?
Well, the answer to that question is yes, they probably will. They'll have to. I think there are some sort of fundamental questions to tackle in that journey. I think the first thing is to understand why they buy dollars, and I think it comes down to principally two reasons. One is that China, about 5 or 6 years ago, switched its economic policy from growth at all costs to one of focusing on stability. And the reason for focusing on stability is they basically wanted a stable financial system so they could launch a pathway for the yuan to ultimately take over from the dollar in the Asia Pacific region as the major currency. And there's a whole, there's a chain of various decisions they can make around that, such as developing trade credit, developing a digital yuan, encouraging foreigners to buy Chinese bonds. All those things have been done. But the Chinese basically need to persist with this to make sure that the yuan is a viable long-term currency. Now, the issue is that they've spent 5 years, if you like, stabilizing the yuan. This yuan has been remarkably stable over that time. In fact, all Asian currencies are, and one hesitates to use the word the Asian euro, but if you go and have a look at Asian currencies or cross-currency rates, there's been a de facto Asian euro existing since about 2016. The degree of volatility in Asian currency markets has dropped to levels last seen during the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system back in the 60s. That was the success they had until March of this year, when everything exploded. Volatility spiked, they could no longer hold it, and you saw this unraveling of this currency system. And that, I think, has been deliberately employed by the US, helped perhaps by a Trojan horse called the Japanese yen, which saw a very deliberate devaluation in March of this year, and precipitated problems for China as well. So I think that's the backdrop we're going through. I think in terms of the longer term, one's got to think about where China deploys its surplus. And this is an issue for Russia, and it's an issue for China as well. If you've got countries that have got very, very large trade surpluses, the question is, where do they put them? And there's not an easy answer, because the US is the only market really that can take financial assets of that degree. And if they don't invest in US financial assets, what will they do with their surplus? Presumably they'll have to use it, or they'll have to redeploy it elsewhere, either amongst each other, so the Chinese buying rubles, well, good luck with that, the Russians buying yuan currency, or both of them starting to invest heavily in infrastructure and reviving the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's plain geopolitics.
Last area to touch upon for today, Mike. I saw that your cross-border capitals data was quoted by the great Ambrose Evans Pritchard in the Telegraph a couple of weeks ago, talking about your data showing there's been a big decline in global liquidity recently. I don't remember exact numbers he quoted, but scarily large decline in global liquidity. What does that mean for everything that you've been talking about, and do you expect that to level off and to for the liquidity situation to come back, and what's caused it?
Well, what's caused it has been central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve. It hasn't been helped by the rise in oil prices, which has reinforced the decline in liquidity. But central banks are really deliberately tightening aggressively. The Federal Reserve has got the bit between its teeth right now. It is trying to create a recession in the US and probably in the global economy too. And they, as always, are not going to stop until something breaks. And that break historically has been something in the US credit markets. So watch this space.
Well, I mean, this was a very good, in follow up to the piece I was referring to. I think it was Ambrose Evans Pritchard yet again talking about whether or not the Fed and other central banks, including the bank, especially the Bank of England, potentially the ECB, although as Alan Sked said, probably they're not going to go very far. Are they tightening at the wrong time? They should have been, if you're a monetarist, they should have been doing this 18 months ago when all the signals were flashing that we got inflation on the way. This is long before Ukraine, long before all the recent disasters. And now, according to the data, they should be loosening again. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that, there's an old Irish joke, isn't there, which says if you want to travel to Dublin, don't start from here. And I think that the issue is that they're tightening at the wrong time. They've got the timing wrong. I think that the excesses that occurred last year when there was this huge QE operations going on is really been stoking the inflation fires right now. They shouldn't have done that. On the other hand, I mean, you've got to have some sympathy for the central banks because we've got so much debt out there that the global financial system has largely become a refinancing system.
Yeah,
you quoted the numbers for debt right at the beginning of this talk. They are eye-wateringly large, but what central banks and what a lot of academics tend to forget is that the financial system is a refinancing system because debt has to be rolled over. And if you've got 300 trillion of debt out there with a 5-year maturity, that means 60 trillion of debt has to be rolled each year. You need balance sheet to do that, balance sheet capacity, and balance sheet capacity is liquidity. So you can see why there is an urgency for the central banks to keep pumping liquidity into the system. They'll have to do it again. And we said back, whatever it was, 12, 13 years ago at the time of the GFC, don't expect a single QE. This is a bottle of pills labeled QE1, QE2, QE3, etc. It's going to keep going forever. And we'll see another QE exercise very soon.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us on IFI Global Vision. We'll let you get on with your Monday afternoon, wherever you may be. And Samantha, if you don't mind putting Mike back down to the audience and bringing up Peter Critwell, hopefully he's there.
Yeah, he should be coming up.
It's also this. We have Peter's our non-LSC interloper today. We always we tend to allow one in each time we do this. So welcome along, Peter. Thanks very much for joining IFI Global Vision.
You're lucky to get one, Simon. That's the way you should look at it.
I don't know how much of what I've been talking to Alan Sked about and Mike Howell about you were able to catch, but I wanted to bring it all together in this conversation with you to a certain extent and talk about what does this mean for people who are involved in risk in the fund industry. And if the world is as scary as both Alan and Mike have been portraying, what does that mean for the likes of people who have to oversee risk in the business? Before you answer that particular question, I'm going to put to you, we've just done some research which we've just published in the net. I'm not going to go through a chapter and verse now, but I am going to make the big, bold, brassy headline out of it is the majority of people who participated in this survey said that they do not think that the right people are in place or the industry has the right structures in place to oversee risk going forward, given the situation perhaps we are in today. So what's your reaction to that, and what you've just heard, perhaps?
Well, I certainly won't take it personally, but I do think that in terms, I mean, okay, firstly, I think you need to differentiate between a lot of this geopolitical stuff and what is the actual job of a risk manager. And I know that you'd like us to believe that we should all get very excited about the fact that Ukraine is a world-changing event, etc. But I'm afraid back in the bunkers of risk management, it's just another event of which there are many. And we look to history a lot to try and understand what's going on. I was on a board meeting recently, and they were wondering about rise in gilts. And to be honest, gilts haven't had the rise they've had recently until you go back to the 90s, but they certainly had some fun times then. On top of that, you know, we've had two 100, you know, once in 100-year events in the last 15 years. I think we're all up to speed on the fact that it's a big bad world out there. And I don't think, however, it's the matter of risk. It is the perspective of a risk manager or a funds risk manager to actually get themselves into sort of, yeah, you know, the EU might break up, very, you know, it is possible. Those are investment management decisions primarily, and I think what a risk manager needs to do is ensure that the risk of a fund is consistent with the whatever it is the investment manager put on the tin when they invested in so that investors get what they thought they should get. So what this really means is that, yeah, do we have to take account of the macroeconomic environment? Undoubtedly. In fact, with all of the scary stories going around, it could be that it'll be the role of the risk manager to actually get managers to take more risk, because they will retreat into their shells, buy a whole load of T-bills, and sit there, not losing, not making any money, which is completely inconsistent with their mandates. So I think that's actually possibly going to be one of the more challenging ones. Everyone's out there saying, you know, world's going to end, or at least the European part of the world's going to end, and it's going to be owned by America, etc. We're going to have a flood of refugees, bad for everybody. This is normal geopolitics. I would actually agree with you that the last 10 years, the wet blanket of Fed and ECB money has undoubtedly made it slightly less interesting, slightly. I mean, you have to admit that we did have a 1 in 100-year collapse in the markets to give us that 10-year wet blanket, closely followed by another 1 in 100-year COVID bust then bounce, followed by a lot more money. But that's the reality of the fund management business. And I think in terms of what we are trying to do as risk managers is try to ensure, and it is getting more complicated without a shadow of a doubt, try to ensure that the manager is taking the risk that is consistent with their mandate. You asked as to whether we have the right people. Well, I think it's the standard answer. It's getting better. And I think part of that, and you know, one would hate to overpraise regulators, but their insistence on becoming less tick box in terms of their monitoring has meant that you're having less box tickers in the jobs. On top of this, they've had some interesting points. The liquidity, the introduction of liquidity risk management, to the degree it has taken off, I think was actually fairly, it was a fairly, you know, from a European risk perspective, quite a rapid response to the liquidity events that we saw in COVID. So I think there is a movement in that direction in terms of the skill set. In other words, there are more risk managers that actually have got both investment and risk management experience. And in terms of an overarching framework, I do think parts of the framework are getting slightly messed up. I mean, if you're in a mega manco with, you know, a couple of hundred funds, being the single DP for risk is, shall we say, possibly a challenging role. And, you know, maybe that needs to be looked at a little bit closer. But overall, I think that sort of going from where we were 5 years ago to where we are today, you know, changes have been made. Some of them have been good, some of them have been fairly neutral. But overall, I think that in a world of geopolitical disasters, and in a world where, you know, you can always look forward and see, you know, everything's going to go wrong. That's not our job. Our job is to make certain the managers are doing what they actually are being paid to do.
There's a couple of things I want to come back to you on in terms of what you just said. The first one, which is perhaps just where you ended that, is that I totally take that point that those of you involved in the oversight of risk management or conducting risk management, your job is to make sure the fund stays within its risk limits, check the liquidity the whole time, and that could be scary in certain situations and has been in the past and probably will be again in the future at some particular point. That's your job. I get that. I understand that. Do you think beyond that there should be, and I think if I've understood you correctly, you're saying that, you know, if an investor decides to invest in investment scheme X, you know, that's his or her decision, and, you know, he's taking or she's taking a punt on where the world will go in certain situations. The people who are doing the risk, making sure that it, you know, fulfills the mandate of the particular fund that that person is investing in. But do you think beyond that there should be people in the fund management industry somewhere who are probably not there today, who are looking at the world from a less, for want of a better term, numeric, algebraic, mathematical way that I don't see existing very much at the moment. Those people are not in the business. They're very good with the numbers. They do all of that perfectly well, or probably extremely well. But should there be people, not necessarily working at Risk System or working in Dublin or working wherever they may be, but should there be people drafted in? I'm thinking in particular, should there be people brought in on boards who come from, Mike just mentioned RUSI, who are on, maybe work for RUSI, or in Washington, DC, there's countless think tanks. There's doubtless other ones in London and Paris and goodness knows where else. Should there be people on boards who are thinking in a non-quantifiable way that would complement the work the likes of someone like you are doing?
So you don't want to use algorithms? Yeah, well, I'll pass on that one forever. Sorry, I really think that, well, is there a role for them? Yes, there is. And I think that's what a lot of investment managers have an investment committee for. Whether a board should get involved, I think that is, I mean, firstly, I would say a board should determine whether or not the fund manager is offering an appropriate product. So in other words, if you're at the moment saying, I'm launching a fund that's going to buy Ukrainian debt, you need to make certain that's sort of going to have the right health warnings, etc. on it, and you might need to be quite careful as to what you do. However, I'm very, very nervous of having as it were, a sort of global political talking shop, which cannot come up with actionable output. So it'll tell you that bad things can happen. It can tell you that things could get worse, but I find it difficult to see a situation where you can overlay that analysis with a sort of the investment management role or the risk management role of a fund. They, you know, undoubtedly for someone with my amount of gray hair, I'll get a reasonably good chance of getting on such a body. But I don't think, if the body cannot actually come up with actionable output, then what is its value apart from people getting rather depressed about the future of the world? And that's my concern.
My point would be, when we do one of these things again, I might put you into a debate with somebody I speak to quite often called Bob Swarup, who thinks there should be more role-playing, some more gaming, whatever term you want to use, where you are looking around the corner, not at the immediate risks that we are now know that are out there today, but what could be around the corner. You're gaming that, so you know that, I'm not saying that situation will occur, but you are at least partly prepared for it if it does, if you've already gamed it.
I would have said that gaming thing. So in other words, but I think what you're talking about is some sort of stress testing. So in other words, that is already part of what we do. So in other words, if I come up with a stress and I can sort of parameterize these various things, and I can come up with the time horizon, that gives me actionable output. But I don't think I need to have another committee to do that. We can already look at this sort of stuff. In fact, you know, we were doing it for Brexit. We were doing it before the Ukraine war. Sad, you know, sad as it is, started off. Unsurprisingly, actually the Brexit output was actually reasonably all right. The Ukrainian war one was all over the shop. But you know, but I do think that is part of ongoing risk management. So in other words, you do need, you know, I don't think that sort of, you know, when we look at historical stress tests, we're not really actually saying, well, if I held my portfolio back then, this is what happened. What we're really saying is, if something like this happens again, what happens to the portfolio? And that's really what we're trying to do. We are actually, all of this stuff is forecast. When you put together a Monte Carlo simulation and you start messing with the parameters quite seriously, that gives you an idea of how much you can lose if certain events happen consistently. All of that, I think, is part of the risk management, the current risk management tools. And again, I think, you know, quite important for determining whether or not the manager's either under or over risking their portfolio. I am just unconvinced. I mean, there might be a role for somebody who comes up with these scenarios. So in other words, where you actually come up with a sort of consistent set of scenarios with a sort of an assumed equal likelihood. In that case, you can then sort of work out whether or not, you know, your different portfolios will have different outcomes. Well, obviously will have different outcomes, but you could then give a sort of geopolitical ranking based on these equivalent scenario outputs. Quite difficult to do, however, I would have thought.
Okay. And last question I want to ask you is that you being in Dublin, and I know you do a lot of work, lots of Mancos there, and in Luxembourg too, as well. In the EU, this is for those Americans following this, can you explain the benefits or otherwise of having this separation of risk and portfolio management, which they don't have over here? Because there you are, you have to do the risk in the jurisdiction where the fund is domiciled, the portfolio managers in New York or in London or wherever he or it may be. In these times of geopolitical crisis, does that make sense?
Having risk independent from investment management, I think it's utterly obvious in my viewpoint. You wouldn't actually have an accountant doing the investment management. Why would you have a risk manager? Or maybe you do have your accountants doing it, but I think that's a bad idea. But I think that you need to have independent risk management. I think that given the structure, which has been set up, a Manco structure, relying on, if you've got a Manco with 30 funds, relying on 30 different risk reports to try and understand what's going on is a bit crazy, to be honest. Different types of funds need different types of reporting. So, you know, in the US, you've got convert, you know, you have a lot broader range of things. You know, a long only equity fund will have a risk report that looks decidedly different to a asset backed. So you need to actually have some sort of centralized process whereby if you want to have access to the 500 million European investors, you get a standardized product. Is there an overlay? Absolutely. I mean, I sort of, when I was DP for risk for a Manco, we'd have monthly calls. I think we added some value, possibly not a lot, but it certainly, it wasn't considered to be an overly onerous perspective from the fund managers in the States. And in fact, in some situations, I think we both learned.
All right. Last question, I guess, for the day, because we're at 3 o'clock in the UK now. The hour is up. Quickly, do you think that the structures, coming back to what I've already asked you, rather naughtily at the very beginning, let's not say the people, but do you think the structures that you have in place in the European Union, I'm thinking principally Dublin and Luxembourg, in the way we've just talked about the separation of risk and portfolio management, makes sense for the world we are in or going into?
I think if we get into a world where geopolitical risk becomes extremely elevated, then the current structure where you can have a single DP for risk and a single DP for investment management over a vast number of funds is looking slightly shaky, because it comes down to power without responsibility, or responsibility without power. If you have too many things, you know, I think we found it out to some extent in COVID. when things went wrong in a lot of portfolios at the same time. And it became a matter of triage as to which ones you dealt with first, because you couldn't deal with all of them at the same time because of the fact that there is an apex type structure with a single DP for risk. I think if you're in that sort of world and it becomes even shakier, that could be problematic.
Right. Well, Peter, thank you very much for joining us on IFI Global Vision today. For those of you who are still with us, let me say that we have another event at, I think, UK time, 5 p.m. in the afternoon next Tuesday, looking at distribution opportunities, particularly for US managers in Europe. And then we have a physical event, our first physical event in 2.5 years in Midtown Manhattan at the Cornell Club on Thursday, looking at debt funds and CLOs and all that good stuff. So have a very good day wherever you may be, and hopefully see you the next time. And as I said earlier on, we will be doing, there've been some messages during this thing, are you doing a recording of this? Absolutely. We're going to be using this as I think, as a recording to promote what we're doing in fund risk governance. So there will be a version of that up in a few days' time. So thank you very much, Peter, and to everybody who's still there.
Thank you very much.
Hopefully see you the next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.